welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. We're going to discuss hydrogen standards today. Just a quick word about us. We are Bellona, a climate NGO originally from Norway, and people bringing this event to you are Bellona Europa. We are established in Brussels, and we mostly work on EU policy and industrial decarbonization. And through this angle, we've been looking at hydrogen for a few years. I'm gonna pass the word to Rachel from the Natural Resource Defense Council that helped us put together this event, and we're very pleased to have you here, Rachel.
Thank you, Marta, and hello, everyone. I'm Rachel Fakri, and I'm the Policy Director of Emerging Technologies. For NRDC, we're an international NGO based in New York, but with 3 million members in the US and offices in China, India, and I believe Latin America. I have the great pleasure of introducing our opening remarks provider, Mr. Sheldon Whitehouse. Senator Whitehouse, reading your bio and prepping for these remarks was really a wonderful reminder of what is commendable, transformative public service. So we're thrilled to have you open this event for us. Senator Whitehouse represents the state of Rhode Island in the United States Senate and is one of the Senate's leading climate champions. He co-founded the Senate Climate Action Task Force to build support for action to address carbon pollution, shaped major climate components of Senate Democrats' historic Inflation Reduction Act, which is expected to put the U.S. on course for 40% greenhouse gas reductions by 2030. The Senator has led the introduction of legislation establishing a price on carbon and instituting a carbon border adjustment to incentivize traded industries to prioritize decarbonization. So we're dealing with some of the thankless parts of the climate crisis via legislation. Topical to today's discussion, Senator Whitehouse has been a champion of ensuring that the nascent U.S. clean hydrogen market is based on solid climate foundations, and that we're not U-turning on our climate goals with sloppy hydrogen policies. He led a high-profile letter with 2 other key Democratic senators, Senators Heinrich and Merkley, urging President Biden's administration to require rigorous, climate-aligned rules to govern hydrogen production that would qualify for the very lucrative clean hydrogen tax credits in the IRA to ensure that we're only subsidizing truly clean hydrogen. Specifically, Senator Whitehouse has become a leading champion of the 3 pillars of additionality, deliverability, and hourly matching, which have become a global staple of the discussions around ensuring that hydrogen production does not wreak havoc on the decarbonization of our grids, which is the single most important tool we have in this decade to keep climate goals within reach. So with that, Senators, we're thrilled to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rachel. It is wonderful to be with you. I am a huge admirer of NRDC, and thank you, Bellona, for hosting this. I will talk about clean hydrogen first in the larger context of where we are on climate. We're gathered here in a country that relies on oil and gas for 40% of its tax revenues, at a COP run by the head of a state-owned oil company, swarmed by lobbyists from the fossil fuel super majors, companies which talk a big game but behind closed doors create massive political impediments to any meaningful climate policy. And COP after COP, the carbon dioxide and methane saturation of our planet has climbed steadily upward. America's Inflation Reduction Act and the EU's CBAM are poised to reduce the harm. The IRA is kickstarting and commercializing new clean technologies. The CBAM will create a global price signal rewarding low-carbon innovation. But we are a long way from a pathway to climate safety, so there's no time for greenwashing boondoggles or fossil fuel handouts. Which brings us to clean hydrogen, a technology that could be one of the most versatile deep decarbonization tools in our arsenal, or could be one of the most egregious fossil fuel shell games ever conceived. It all depends on how we count clean. First, the good news. Beyond just displacing dirty fossil-based hydrogen currently used in the production of fertilizers and chemicals, there are myriad other applications for clean hydrogen. Zero carbon e-fuels for aviation and shipping, replacing coke in steel making, even long-term grid storage. Its versatility has earned it a reputation as the Swiss Army knife of our decarbonization toolkit. Indeed, clean hydrogen will likely be one of the primary ways that energy-intensive industries like cement and steel decarbonize in response to policies like the EU CBAM. So that's the good news. Here's the bad news. Producing hydrogen with an electrolyzer requires enormous amounts of power, 3 times the power output of the produced hydrogen. Time, investment, and innovation will likely improve that ratio, but it will always be more efficient where possible to electrify processes with zero carbon electricity. Where electrification is not feasible, clean hydrogen fills the bill if we get the guardrails right. If we get them wrong, we could force taxpayers to subsidize electrolytic clean hydrogen that has a worse carbon footprint than the fossil fuel it displaces, as much as $3 of subsidy per kilogram of greenwashed hydrogen. So we can't get the rules wrong. The rules have to look back to the demand load an electrolyzer introduces to the grid. In a power system with growing but with limited clean power like the US, an electrolyzer can nominally claim existing clean generation, but in reality induce added grid demand backfilled by added fossil generation. Net effect, emissions worsen. Short-sighted accounting might call that clean hydrogen, but if you follow the supply chain through to its effect on the grid, physics belies the false accounting. Standards for clean hydrogen that accord with this reality need to stand on 3 pillars. The first is additionality. If you're an electrolyzer coming onto the grid, you need to bring your own zero carbon generation. That could be in the form of a new wind turbine, or it could be additional capacity unlocked by the retrofit of an existing asset. It cannot be assigning yourself existing power for instance, a decades-old hydroelectric dam, unless you can prove that you're using previously unclaimed excess capacity. The second is deliverability. Hydrogen electrolyzers should only be allowed to claim electricity that can physically, electron by electron, be delivered to them. Offshore wind in Denmark should not be allocated to an electrolyzer in the Middle East. The fake assignment games become too easy to play. The third is time matching. Production of clean hydrogen should occur while its zero carbon power is generated. Tracking clean energy production this way is not easy, but there is a serious risk of misalignment and fossil fuel being dispatched to meet the electrolyzer's need during periods of misalignment. The EU renewable hydrogen standards are based on these 3 pillars, so bravo to the EU. And if recent press reports are true and the Biden administration can hold up against fossil fuel lobbying, the administration will soon announce similar strong rules for the IRA's 45V clean hydrogen tax credit. Together, these 2 rules can lay the foundation for a robust clean energy economy that contributes to a pathway to climate safety we do not now have. This is also a test for the fossil fuel industry. In the US, it has mounted a major PR campaign demanding a 45V hydrogen gravy train with lax safeguards. Consistent with its decades of climate denial tactics, it promulgates a myth that strong hydrogen standards will kneecap this nascent industry, ignoring the pipeline of hydrogen projects compliant with these rules already underway in Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, the Netherlands, Oklahoma, France, and Spain. In the US, the 45Q carbon capture sequestration tax credit gives added support to so-called blue hydrogen. Billions of dollars are going to hydrogen hubs to stimulate demand and kickstart both blue and clean hydrogen. I am all for supporting this industry responsibly, but we must not cave on these standards. The last thing I'll say is that the European Union CBAM is important here. Its carbon tariff for aluminum, steel, cement, fertilizers, and hydrogen will reward hydrogen made in accordance with the three pillars and send a powerful market signal. The United States will likely gain market share under the EU CBAM because we are less carbon intensive than other major EU trading partners like China. The Biden administration clean hydrogen tax credit should extend that advantage for our hydrogen industry and our clean hydrogen customers. If the US joins in with a CBAM of our own, the benefits get still better. And if the EU and the United States and the UK and Canada and Australia and Japan all join in, suddenly a pathway for real clean hydrogen and for real climate safety gets much clearer. It creates a global race to the top, not just for hydrogen, but for all the low carbon intensity products clean hydrogen can deliver. Imagine innovators and manufacturers clambering over each other to develop the most cutting-edge, efficient ways to produce steel, chemicals, even complex consumer goods like automobiles and pharmaceuticals. If we want to see a lasting, sustainable market for clean hydrogen and real international progress on climate, there is simply no substitute for coordinated CBAMs and legitimately clean hydrogen. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Senator Whitehouse, for your opening remarks. So as the Senator just let us know, Europe has been developing standards for clean hydrogen, and they were relatively recently adopted. These standards are based on three pillars. The first pillar being what we call additionality. So the fact that for every electron, that is used by an electrolyzer to produce hydrogen, we need to bring that in the grid. We cannot claim existing renewables, we need to use new renewables. Unless there is renewables available on the grid that would otherwise be curtailed. The second pillar is the pillar of what we've been calling geographical matching, deliverability in the US. So the fact that there needs to be a physical grid to connect the electrolyzer with the renewable production. And the third pillar is what we've been calling temporal matching. Without temporal matching, so the fact that we use the renewables when they're available, we completely lose the flexibility of hydrogen. Hydrogen can give a service to the grid, can provide a service to the grid. The fact that we can, absorb renewables when they're abundant and we don't need them, but also give back to the grid, using the hydrogen as a backup power when renewables are not available. So, the fight in the EU has been very long to develop these standards, but now they're enshrined into this additionality delegated act. So I wanted to ask you, Michael Bloch, to introduce yourself a little bit and to ask about the process in the EU and how can the US and the rest of the world learn from this experience.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really interesting and inspiring, and I heard the words of the senator to keep CBAM. So I'm Michael Bloss. I'm from the Green Party in Germany, an EU legislator. I was working a lot on the Green Deal in general. Actually, around 1 year ago, we had our huge, big negotiation rounds around CBAM, but also about the emission trading system, so the ETS, and everything this is connected with this. And maybe the first thing is, we now have an architecture that should bring us really into carbon neutrality by 2050, minus 55% of CO2 emissions by 2030. That is the ETS, so a carbon price. And this is the renewable directive, meaning 42.5% of primary energy production in 2030 should be from renewables, and some other legislation on transport and buildings. Now with the renewable directive, which is really great, 45% of primary electricity production it's or 42.5. It's around 80% of electricity. Now the problem, of course, is always that it's not only 80% of electricity, but we are going to increase the amount of electricity consumed quite a lot, because of course we have to replace coal, gas and oil in all of the different sectors. And how do we do it? With electricity, and also with green hydrogen. And therefore we need to have, the pressure was there to have this additionality and the time matching, because if you do not have it, basically what will happen is just some substitutions effect in some kinds of, in our renewable production. In Germany we currently have around 60% of our electricity production from renewables. At times we have 100% of electricity production from renewables. And if you just create green certificates and allocate them at some point, and like 2 weeks later we might have no wind and no sun, and then everything works on gas and coal, and then we produce green hydrogen from that electricity, that doesn't work. So therefore these criteria are very important. They make sure that it's really green for us, green, not clean green, that's from renewables. But of course there was a lot of pressure from different kinds of business interests. From the, let's say, more fossil business interests, they wanted to allow for green hydrogen production also from their fossil capacity, but also from hydrogen stakeholders they said we cannot start investing before we do not know what is the definition of green hydrogen. So therefore that there was a lot of pressure. Normally that definition in European law is nothing that EU legislators are concerned with. It's something that the definitions are delegated acts done by the Commission themselves, which we are just putting the principles and they do the definitions. But it was, it became a big political conflict, amounting in the situation where the European Parliament defined in a legislation what is green hydrogen, even though that we shouldn't be doing that, and putting pressure on the Commission to finally come up with a green hydrogen definition. So that was around 1.5 years ago. Now, just recently, the EU Commission came up with it, which was quite matching to what the EU legislators wanted. There was some, going a little bit more deeper into it, there is still some transition phase, which we would have loved the transition phase to be a bit shorter. Now, the fully fledged, clear additionality and time matching and deliverability is coming into place from 2030 onwards. But at least then we have it, and then it's clear, and now it's also the investment environment is clear for those who want to invest into green electricity production to produce hydrogen, and for those who want to use clean hydrogen or green hydrogen for their facilities. So that's it. We have the definition now. Actually, if it would be to me, I would have had the transition period shortened a bit, because, well, with what is on the table right now, it doesn't really help us in the increase of renewable deployment until 2030. Only from 2030 onwards it will help us to increase the renewable deployment. But I'm happy that we have it, and I'm sure that in the US and in the rest of the world it could set a standard, because one thing is clear: we will not produce all of our green hydrogen in Europe. I hope most of it, but then what we import needs to have the same standard as what we produce in Europe ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this contribution. So if you can pass the mic all the way here. Unfortunately, we only have one. But so the US is right now developing the guidelines for what qualifies under the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies. In particular, there's a lot of discussion around renewable hydrogen and whether or not it should be matching these pillars that are coming from the EU. So there was a leak a couple of days ago. We saw it, and I wanted to ask you, Rachel, what's your take on these leaked guidances, and what's the nature of the pushback that you're observing in the media in the US?
Thank you, Marta. Indeed, the leak that happened from the forthcoming guidance ended up culminating a year of excess drama around this. So, Michael, I think everything you have all fought for in the EU ended up being an incredible nerve center for what we asked for in the US. So, this gives you a sense of how a global race to the top can really kick off, and the EU helped immensely with that. But maybe take a step back over what's happening in the US for folks who are not as aware. The senator did a great job at laying it out, but the Inflation Reduction Act, so the US flagship climate policy that passed a year and a half ago now, includes one of the largest subsidies for clean hydrogen in the world. It's a production tax credit for clean hydrogen production that's offered for every kilogram of hydrogen produced. The producer receives a pretty lucrative $3 per kilogram tax credit. According to some estimates, it could cover up to 90% of the production cost of the hydrogen. It's a very large subsidy, uncapped, so it could run into several hundreds of billions of dollars based on some studies. And the subsidy is tied to how clean the hydrogen is, so its greenhouse gas intensity. Now that's difficult to calculate based on what we are hearing today. Luckily, the statute does require that the U.S. Treasury determine a methodology for how projects should calculate those emissions to then qualify for credit. And this is the most important part. And this is what the EU grappled with, and the US is currently grappling with. How do you calculate those emissions? Now, interestingly, the statute also charts a direction for Treasury to do that, requiring it to look at the total system emissions of a hydrogen project. So, if a hydrogen project locates on the grid and adds a lot of demand to the grid, increases emissions on the grid because fossil fuels increase to meet that gap, those emissions have to be taken into account and have to determine whether the hydrogen qualifies. So this substitution can't happen, right? Hydrogen cannot increase emissions on the grid to qualify for the credit. And the only way for projects not to increase emissions on the grid is to comply with those three pillars of additionality, deliverability, and hourly matching, which really the essence of those pillars are just a requirement that hydrogen projects, which are very power hungry, as the senator alluded to, are very mindful of the source, the location, and the hour in which they're drawing the power. And only those three pillars enable hydrogen to not increase emissions on the grid and to qualify for the tax credits. So it's been the same fight as the EU. It's been a deja vu for a lot of folks who were involved in the EU process, where we have a lot of folks in support of these strong rules. Policymakers, the senator is an excellent example of that, has been champion of those rules. Eric and his company Air Products and a lot of other companies, champions of strong rules. All the environmental community are behind them. Similar as in the EU, we do have some companies who essentially want to do very little, want to do the substitution game. I just, on paper, will allocate myself a decade-old hydro plant as now powering my facility, increasing emissions on the grid, wreaking havoc on grid decarbonization, and still getting the credit. So we are in a fight. It's very similar to the EU, whereby some folks are fighting for strong rules, some companies are fighting for very weak rules. The leak that happened, which I think the White House is very upset about, foreshadowed that the rules are going to be hopefully very strong and similar to the EU. So we're talking additionality from day one. A hydrogen project has to demonstrate it's powered by new clean energy that's not already powering homes and businesses from day one, with a phase-in of hourly in 2028. So that's your dream, maybe, for a shorter phase-in. The EU phases in hourly matching in 2030. The US is proposing 2028. So really excellent rules. Unfortunately, there's still a big lobbying blitz trying to weaken those rules and prevent this proposal from actually being dropped, which the senator, I think, alluded to earlier. So now there's a continuous fight to make sure that those proposed rules drop when they land, because they are excellent. They will enable and activate that global race to the top. If the US and the EU have all of a sudden very strong standards, that will create that gravitational force upward, right, for how this global market develops. And I'm sure Eric can speak a lot to how important this harmonization is for industry scale up.
Thank you, Rachel, for the take on the US. We have as well Hemant Malaya that is here to talk to us about what's happening in a third big region for hydrogen in the world, India. So the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy in India reached its decision for 2 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen limit in terms of carbon intensity for what can qualify as clean hydrogen. This is a threshold, but doesn't have a methodology. We've been talking about the difference between setting a rule, but then how do we calculate what goes in there? So, Hemant, I wanted to ask you to introduce yourself and give us a little bit of the take of what happened, what's happening, and what do you think will happen in India in terms of the next press of the processes and the development of this methodology.
Great, thanks for having me here. Just before I begin, we do work with the government to define these standards and develop the methodology. So all the views that I expressed today are mine, not of the government. Having said that, I think um, in some ways, the definition that we have right now, the standard that we have right now, flouts all three of your pillars. So I'm glad the senator is not here. But I think one needs to understand the context in which the definition or standard was developed and the market and operational structure in India, which is very different from what you would find in the developed countries. Right? So let's take additionality into begin. So in India, all renewable power uh, you know, generation sites or projects have something called a PPA, power purchasing agreement with the distribution companies. And so they're locked in terms of where they deliver their power. Right? So any new project has a choice either to deliver power into the grid and lock into another PPA or go exclusively hydrogen. There's no choice of picking, a partial amount that goes into the grid and partially, being delivered to hydrogen generation. So in some ways, the market structure itself limits, the possibility of not having additionality. I think the only scope that would even exist is if you have curtailment of power, especially in wind, maybe in solar in the future, although we don't have a whole lot right now. Some of that curtailed power could get directed towards hydrogen generation, but from our perspective, that's a good thing. Right now, if it's being curtailed, might as well use it for hydrogen production. The other provision that we have is what is known as banking. Again, flouts the rule of the 1 hour used within 1 hour of generation. The idea behind the standard when the whole process began was that we want to initiate scale. It's very important for India to achieve scale very quickly because unlike other economies, we are at a phase in our transition, economic transition, where timing is everything. So we are scaling up on our manufacturing, our industrial growth to be able to enable our economic growth. Now, if you are not able to scale immediately, then we lock in more fossil fuel because we don't have any options right now. So timing becomes very important. Also, what is important is the cost effectiveness of green fuels and green energy. The reason we have more than 100 gigawatts of solar and wind capacity today is as a consequence of a precipitous drop in the tariffs from renewable power. So to put things into perspective, solar tariffs today in India are roughly 2.25 rupees per unit compared to coal power plant based tariff, which is more like 3 rupees per unit. So coal is already more expensive. So there's really no motivation to deploy more fossil based capacity. Gas is even more expensive than that. So clearly there is no market incentive for anyone to actually utilize coal based power to make green hydrogen. So then that begs the question as to why do we not have these clauses in the standard that we have? And the answer really is the operationalization and the cost effectiveness of hydrogen that we produce. So as we all know, solar and wind are highly variable, and only way to actually manage the variability or intermittency is to either have storage, um, which is very expensive, or you have electrolyzers like the PEM kind, technology-wise, which can ramp up and down very frequently. But that all those things make green hydrogen more expensive. So if you have to achieve scale, if you have to achieve cost parity or at least cost efficiency, then you have to compromise somewhere. And that trade-off is really reflected in the standard. Now the question is, why do we end up with a two number? So the idea behind that is if we can utilize renewable power for, let's say, 95% of the time, and you want to balance out the remaining 5% and still keep the electrolyzer efficient or utilized, up to the max, then we might have to use, grid power. So the grid power of 5% is a balancing force from an operational perspective. And so if you look at the grid intensity, which is about 0.75 kg per unit, and then 5% grid electricity, then you end up with a rough estimate of about 2 kgs of CO2 per kg of green hydrogen. Also the difference is that we are very limited to within the boundary of the plant, so we are not looking at emissions beyond the plant boundary. So the idea is that eventually the grid will clean up, and then we should be able to scale up, and as we scale up, we'll have more domestic consumption. So India already uses close to 5.5 million tons of grey hydrogen, so that's something that we would like to replace as quickly as possible. We would also like to use green hydrogen for additional capacity in steel making. So right now we have about 150 million tons of steel making capacity, and we plan to double it in the next 7 to 8 years. So again, it's a timing issue. If we don't have green hydrogen at the right price, the fallback option is coal. It's not even gas, and that makes it that much more difficult to transition in the future. So that's how we are looking at the trade-off. There are other things, structural issues I can talk about. One quick thing I can mention is what we call banking, which is when you have peak power from renewables, you can put that into the grid and then take the same amount of power back from the grid, during night times when you don't have enough RE. So that's really an accounting practice, and it's highly being debated on whether it's the right thing to do or not. But functionally, operationally, it does allow developers to get their costs within the limits where they can actually sell it. So that's kind of the logic behind it. Banking is a provision I think is very unique to the Indian standard. I have not seen it in any other countries. So I take a pause here, but happy to answer other questions.
Thank you very much for also putting into perspective what how things might work differently between the global north and the global south. But the market for hydrogen, it seems on the way to become a truly global market in which global companies will be acting. And so I wanted to ask you, Eric, of course, to introduce yourself, but also listening to the perspective from these three countries, regions in the world, what's the take of a company like Air Products, and how do you navigate the existence of different standards? How does that feel for your business?
Thank you. My name is Eric Guder. I'm Vice President of Hydrogen and Air Products. I've been with the company nearly 3 decades and all in the hydrogen space. So it's really exciting for me because the last couple of years my family now knows what I do for a job. Air Products has been it's reasonably the world's largest producer of hydrogen globally, and that's using traditional fossil-based methods as the rest of the world produces this hydrogen. But given our experience in this and our own sustainability ambitions, we're transitioning our own company, and we've announced are investing $15 billion in clean hydrogen projects by 2027. Many of these are already under construction, and several of them are 3-pillar compliant. And I can't stress that enough, because you hear out of industry a lot, we can't do this, we can't do this. Clearly, we can do it. There's this enormous debate about how we should do this or not do this. We have to start at the highest standard, and we have to, beyond the highest standard, we have to have a globally harmonized standard. We have about 25 years to get to our global net zero ambition. So that means we have to remake all of our energy infrastructure in the next 25 years, something that took us over 150 years to do as a society. That is a monumental task. We're spending a lot of time debating about how we do things, or this or that. The faster we get to clarity, the faster we're going to see companies start to make real global investment. I think we're an outlier, being a first mover in this, believing that global governments like the EU, and we hope that the US will follow, will establish a framework that ensures real and verifiable emissions reductions. With that, when we think about the impending clarity on the U.S. IRA regulation, we have the most lucrative tax credit subsidy in the world. There is no reason the U.S. should not have the most stringent standard for clean hydrogen in the world. And the faster we get to this aligned standard, at least in parity with the EU, and that's what the U.S. is signaling right now, the faster we're going to move ahead. It's really important at this COP here in the last couple days, the Hydrogen Council Global, the COP28 Office of the Presidency. They had 15 global CEOs and 20 government leaders from around the world aligning conceptually on the concept for this need for a global harmonization scheme and working towards that. Some of these companies that participated in this, interestingly, are some of the companies that have actively opposed stringency in the 45V, so I'm not sure how they're going to reconcile that, because clearly this is necessary. It's necessary for liftoff. We can do this now. I don't mean to be overly dramatic, but I was thinking about this overnight. When the U.S. Department of Energy launched this ambition, they made a reference to the moonshot back in the 60s. And along with that was JFK's speech on that. And he said something to the fact that we don't do these things because they're easy, we do them because they're hard. We do them because that gets the best of all of our skills and abilities. We do them because we must do them, we cannot delay them, we have to do these things to be successful. I view this whole climate change debate through that lens, given the huge ambition that we have to do, circling back to what we have to do in the next 25 years. So thank you.
Thank you. And now maybe to broaden up the lens a little bit. Now hydrogen it's not going to be consumed as hydrogen. Hydrogen is going to be the feedstock to produce other commodities such as fertilizers, steel, that are as well global commodities, and today are some of these, very high pollutant sectors. So I wanted to ask all of you, what do you think is the importance of setting good standards so that to enable the global trade of also other commodities beyond hydrogen? So I'm thinking steel, fertilizers.
If I may first, global experts agree. Hydrogen's role in the energy transition will be to fill in the areas of our economy that we cannot electrify. If we can directly electrify them, we should. It's a very efficient process. Where we cannot, that most closely aligns with heavy-duty transportation, so hydrogen used as a direct fuel, and also heavy industry. The sectors that were just referred to, steel, glass, cement making. We are demonstrating that you can develop very low and zero carbon sources of hydrogen based on any natural resources that exist in a given geography, but you have to have the capabilities and expertise to do that, and these are the sectors that we should focus on. We don't have a lot of time to debate where hydrogen should play a role. We think from a science-based perspective, as do all leading global experts on this, it's in heavy-duty transportation and heavy industry.
Yeah, I guess the easy answer is yes. It would be great to have harmonization. But the reality is, I think every country has its own challenges. So from our perspective, I think it's more important to be directionally correct, at least as of now, because we are in the very nascent stages of this completely new energy market. More important to be focused on greenness than, so really the question is, are we okay with natural gas-based or coal-based hydrogen in the longer term? So from our perspective, I think that's more important than agreeing on every single aspect of a standard. If you're meeting the same objectives, regardless of how we actually use the words and define the standards, I think that's more important. Also, I think in some ways, if we look at energy today, especially let's say the crude oil market, although it's looked at as one single commodity, it's actually not. So we have sweet versus sour, we have heavy versus light. So can we conceptualize of a green hydrogen market which has variable premiums based on what the standard is, as long as it's green, meaning it's from electrolysis or biomass based, right? So that's probably another way of, I guess, having your cake and eating it too. But maybe a short-term kind of compromise to get the system going, especially in terms of trade, because at least from an Indian perspective, I think we are very clear that we do want to, and it's a stated government objective of being a green hydrogen-based hub globally, which means that regardless of what our domestic standards are, we'll have to comply with our export markets regardless. Right? So that's definitely going to happen. But to get that trade going, I think all of us will have to make compromises if we want to scale up quickly. If each jurisdiction is stuck with its own definition, and often it's a matter of words, not so much what the end operational consequences. I think if there are some leeways that can be looked at, synergies that can be looked at, that might definitely help in the short term. But in the longer run, I think automatically those synergies will emerge because it's just more efficient for trade, and trade will make it happen regardless.
I just wanted to ask you also, the question is how big is the concern in India if you do not have, or if you do not, or if you have different standards than, for instance, what possibly the US have and what Europe has, that it will be difficult to participate. It's a question whether you can enter this market so easily um, when your definition is completely different than the ones the rest of the world complies. And maybe just, I mean, as you said, it's enabling different kinds of products. I think one big misconception is that hydrogen is just replacing oil and gas, and I think that's how it's viewed in many ways. We have in Germany a debate about that we will use green hydrogen substituting gas for heating homes. I think it would be very inefficient. Um, but what I believe is, and what we will have, I mean, basically currently we have a renewable capacity in Germany of maybe, I don't know, like around 100 gigawatts. So if the sun is fully shining and the wind is fully blowing, we are creating more renewable energy than we would consume even if our whole industry is running. And we will have hopefully a capacity until 2030 around 250 gigawatt. So that means we will have lots of times where we overproduce. And this of course is where we can balance and take these peaks of producing also then cheap green hydrogen. And this hopefully will be used then in times of when our power system is not fully fueled by renewables to burn it in gas power stations. But what I want to say is like, yeah, just it's not completely. It is a very different electricity and energy system based on hydrogen than based on fossil fuels, and I think we really have to think a little bit about how this transformation is taking place.
Yeah, just a quick thought on this. So I think if I think about the significance of harmonization, right, I think there are two pieces. You mentioned the bearing on industrial commodities, right? And as we start to think about decarbonizing steel and cement via CBAM mechanisms or others, harmonizing around those three pillars is going to be an activator, an accelerator of finding rules around the trade of these commodities, right? If there is a global acceptance of what is truly green, for instance, hydrogen, then green steel, green ammonia, based on green hydrogen, will be far easily accepted, right, for kind of global trade and the mutual recognition of a green steel or green ammonia. So this is laying the foundation for a much bigger and more impactful platform, right, to decarbonize these really difficult commodities like green steel, like steel and ammonia and others. So I see it as laying the foundation for a broader trade conversation that is really interesting. That's one. Two, and this is where I get concerned around this notion of scale. We have to scale, right? Because not all hydrogen assets are the same, right? I think you mentioned this earlier, and you're just alluding to that. One of the best values of hydrogen is its flexibility. When it's produced on the grid, it can suck up excess clean energy and give it back to the grid when we don't have clean energy. As our grids become far more renewable dominated, this is going to be an excellent value, right? But we're now defining whether hydrogen will be that flexible resource or will not be, because you're going to have different electrolyzers. One that is flexible, this is what we want. One that is inflexible and needs to run all the time, and this is the one that's the most available today, and weak rules will enable that inflexibility that will produce all the time because it's a cheaper technology available today. And if we do that in the name of scale, of just investing, then these are assets that will be on the grid for 20 years. We're stuck with them for a while. We would have wrong-footed the industry into the operational patterns that are not the most helpful, and foregone a lot of technology deployment on the good side, the flexible side, and getting cost reductions there, and getting the right type of deployment. So another reason why those rules are so important to harmonize around is not just for emissions and trade and so on, but to actually channel this technology in the right direction, right? I think, Eric, you mentioned you gotta go fast, right? We need that clarity around speed and so on. And we can do it, right? Scale can be done, but scale for the sake of scale is gonna wrong foot this industry. And these rules will enable us to develop the right kind of assets from the start, because those will be on the grid for 20 plus years.
Thank you, Rachel. I wanted to give the possibility to the audience to ask questions if you want. If not, I'll go on with my long set of questions. Okay, so thinking. Oh, please.
We're just going to have the conversation. When we think about, we're talking about production. How should we produce it? How should we produce it? Production is reasonably the easier part of all of this. What you need for global liftoff certainly is a global certification scheme, but more importantly, global demand. It's a policy-driven energy transition for the first time in the world's history, not an economic-driven one. So without global policy that supports the transition, and that means demand side, we saw this out of the US DOE where they held back $1 billion from the BIL hydrogen hubs because they're trying to figure out demand signal. Europe has very good demand signals, the US does not. It has subsidies. That's the nature of our political machine. But without aligned standards, we will have a slower liftoff of clean hydrogen in the future. Now people will say, well, this is costly. Yes, it's costly, but I would argue it's less expensive than what we do today because we're not fully accounting for all of the costs of our fossil-based economy. We subsidize oil and gas to the tune of about $1 trillion globally every year. We have, I'm from the U.S. We had in 2022 we had over $165 billion of direct damages from climate-related events. That does not take into account the ancillary economic impact of that, and there's no analysis or accounting of the health effects on our citizens. When we draw a box around all that, we're already paying for all this. The debate now is about how we pay for it in the future and how is that fairly accounted for. These arguments are they're red herrings, really. And so I just wanted to highlight that because I think what's most important for global liftoff is this alignment and demand signals.
Thank you. So, yes, please, come ahead, grab the mic, introduce yourself, and ask your question. Perfect.
Thank you very much. My name is Imogen Outlaw from New Climate Institute based in Cologne, Germany. And my organization's been looking at hydrogen from the perspective of what is the role that it can play not only in decarbonization but also in sustainable development in many countries. And I think a lot of countries are coming out with different standards or different national policies about how they want to export. I think the IEA says only 25% will actually be internationally traded. And so I wanted to, one, just kind of put into this discussion, I think when we're talking about hydrogen standards, we also have to talk about not just emissions, but also water use, employment benefits, the local benefits to the country, particularly when we're talking about producers in emerging economies. I think that's something that hasn't been talked about here, but very relevant. And then I had one question when we're talking about having an international standard. I wanted to particularly ask our colleague here from India about what you thought about dynamic benchmarking, and particularly, so essentially to have, for countries that are in emerging economies who maybe have are a different starting point than hydrogen that's produced in Europe or the US, should there be or can there be a role in dynamic benchmarking to not crowd out early projects in high potential countries? Should that be part of the conversation that we are moving in a green direction, but should we recognize some of these differences right now? That they get more stringent with time to kind of recognize that the grid will be greener in the future.
So I guess the second question first. I mean, from our perspective, there'll be two markets or two production, trajectories, if you will. One is, of course, to cater to the, export markets, and the way developers are looking at it is, who's going to be my offtake? If it's going to be Germany or, whoever else in Europe, then they're going to comply with CBAM and the European definition. If it's going to be Singapore or Japan, then their definition matters, and that's kind of one pool. The other pool is more, domestic focused, and that's where the standards are not going to be as stringent from a definitional sense. And again, I think as our grid gets cleaner, the idea is that, and we anticipate storage more to happen on the grid rather than individual plants having their own storage. Because when you're looking at pumped hydro, or you're looking at gravity-based solutions, that's possible on the grid more efficiently than at an individual plant level. So eventually the greening will happen. I think what is more important is to make sure that it's electrolysis-based hydrogen, and the government has taken a very clear stand. In fact, they were initially not even keen on biomass-based clean hydrogen. That's been added, but I think commercially it's not really very feasible. So you might have a few niche solutions on biomass based, but so yeah, I think that differentiation will automatically happen. I do not see us completely harmonizing with EU or US. Maybe US, given that the standard is probably a little bit looser than India is, and also allows for fossil-based hydrogen making. But I think as a target, as an objective, we are clear that it's going to be green hydrogen based on electrolysis, right? In terms of what does it mean socially, it's a fairly complicated question because, and we have some research going on. Do follow us. We put all our research on our website. We'll have our output in like 2-3 months. But there are multiple layers of what we call nexus, right? So one is the water element. In India, the challenge is all the states or locations where you have good RE are also water stressed. Another challenge is all the industries where you need green hydrogen are in different locations from where you have good RE. So all of these are going to be very challenging to top it. We are heavily a coal-based country. Coal, we use a lot of coal, which means socially there's a lot of employment that is dependent on coal. But RE, in contrast, generates a lot of jobs when you're deploying RE, but after that, it just basically dwindles out. So that definitely is a concern. The question is, can we generate livelihoods through hydrogen-based solutions? Now, we as an institution have created livelihood opportunities through RE. Hydrogen is something that we have only started looking at more recently. Things like cooking solutions might be options for hydrogen. It may not be the most efficient, but when you look at the demands in terms of how we cook in India, a flame is essential. So induction-based cooking is very, very difficult. So something like a hydrogen-based cooking solution, which also generates jobs, locally, those might be options that we might look at.
maybe if the others want to add on this question, but I wanted to make it a little bit broader and ask you to reflect also on what does it mean to go to hydrogen, no? Such a power-hungry solution in some geographies whose grids are still struggling to decarbonize, or even worse, lack to access to electricity is still a thing. In many of these countries that today are thinking about producing and exporting hydrogen to Europe or to the global north in general. So how do we strike a balance? Because hydrogen at the same time can bring investment, can bring growth, can bring development of renewables, but at the same time couldn't take away valuable resources from those communities to bring them to Europe. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, great question. There's obviously currently a lot of conversation around Africa becoming a big producer of hydrogen and transporting that in some form, either pure hydrogen or say ammonia, into Europe. And this has sparked a really interesting debate about, are we replicating an extractive scenario where we produce the commodities in Africa and transport those for processing or economic activity in Europe? And for a year, I worked a lot on this issue within the Africa Green Hydrogen Alliance, which was really focused on that. How do you turbocharge production in Africa? I think it's a real challenge, and I think we have to be very creative in the solutions, because replicating an extractive model should not happen. And there are separate, I think this chorus is starting to ramp up. In two dimensions, I would say. There's one, how do we make sure that any hydrogen produced is used for local use first before export? That's one. And luckily, some of the banks that are investing in some of these countries, notably UNIDO, feel very strongly about that, is we're going to prioritize our financing for local use first, right, before the exports. And question number two, which you alluded to, there are 600 plus million people without energy access in Africa. Do we really want to deploy renewables, which should go first and foremost to this use, providing energy access, to produce hydrogen to transport, say, into Germany? I think the answer is no. And I haven't seen a good solution for that yet. Something was floated last year, which was quite interesting. Don't know if there was still, if some effort has been done on this issue, but for every essentially renewable project that is deployed for hydrogen, supported by, say, a European customer, there needs to be investment made for renewables locally, right? Because Africa still has, I think, 2% of global capital for renewables. That's extremely low. So maybe we can leverage hydrogen with good policy to accelerate renewable deployment for the local population. But this needs very strong policy design, and I haven't seen it happen yet. So it's a challenge. I think we have to approach it cautiously and creatively, and go local first and find a solution to make sure energy access is helped by way of leveraging this interest in hydrogen export is going to be a really interesting policy challenge.
Thank you for this. Does anybody else want? Then we're reaching an end, but I wanted to ask a little closing remarks from you. Like, what do you think the world should learn in terms of hydrogen standards? What is for you the number one thing that is important to bring forward in different geographies and different contexts, or according to your perspective?
Well, I think the most important thing is, I mean, we are talking about, one molecule, but it can have anyway different colors, and that green hydrogen is not the same as blue or gray. So hydrogen is only an advantage if it's green. That's the whole point. I mean, there's no use. It's better to use natural gas in producing steel than gray hydrogen. I mean, the CO2 emissions for gray hydrogen are higher. So it's really about this green hydrogen. That means it is produced from renewables, and that needs to be the gold standard. And then there's more. I think cooking with hydrogen, is that really a thing? Okay, because at least what I, but you know that better, but I mean well, it is not such an easy thing to work with. No, it's highly explosive. You have to have high pressure. So I'm wondering if this kind of physical or attitudes of this molecule will make it difficult. For instance, I think to use it, for instance, for cooking or even for driving cars with it. So maybe we have to think a little bit around that this is also limiting the use of hydrogen.
So I guess, to answer your question, distributed hydrogen should be a thing. I don't think it is yet, but I think there is enough scope. At least in India there is. But closing remarks, I think we should look for synergies rather than a perfect alignment. I think that will, give us much more dividends than trying to replicate exactly the same thing everywhere. That's quite likely not going to happen. The second thing is, I think it's more important to look at pathways and ensure pathways are green rather than getting the same number, which is whatever kgs of CO2 per kg of green hydrogen. That I think is less important than the pathway choice. And as long as I think the pathway choice is right, eventually we'll get there. Probably later than some, sooner than others. But I think that is more important.
I think when you are thinking about energy production globally, you have to think about how it's done today. It's done where the resources exist. And in the next iteration of a clean economy, we're talking about the similar situation where there are going to be natural producers, natural importers, but it should focus on where the confluence of resources exist to produce low and zero CI fuels, including hydrogen. We should focus on carbon intensity, not methods, technology agnostic, level competitive playing field, harmonized certification schemes to move faster. We can't have emissions being driven up by people rushing to have be first movers, thinking we're going to scale up. You touched on safety. I want to be clear about safety. We've been producing, distributing, dispensing hydrogen since 1957. It is very safe. All transportation fuels have hazards. They're only made safe by the companies that handle them. We've been dispensing hydrogen into vehicles for decades. Very safe process. I drive a hydrogen fuel cell car. Very safe process. So we have to dispel some of these misnomers. What's really needed here, and I'm so excited that all of you came to participate today, is a massive amount of global education. And that's why it's so frustrating through this whole process, because it's an energy-driven policy, a policy-driven energy transition. So every elected official has to become an expert in energy policy. And then every regulator has to do that. And then every company has to do it. And all the population has it. It is a massive public education effort to help people understand how we're going to get there. But appreciate all of you joining today. It's been great.
Thanks, Eric. I'll be brief. I think in short, we have very little time to get this right. This is 2023, almost 2024. We have less than 25 years to get this right. So we need to sprint to where this technology fits best and how it should be best, right, on our energy system. It's an exciting time. We're building this from kind of scratch. So this is where harmonization, synergy, whatever you want to call it, is so important, because if we do this globally, right, we will sprint right to where this technology's best potential. Scale for the sake of scale will not deliver, right, the benefits of this technology. And the layers of benefits that could be activated are extremely interesting by way of harmonizing around strong standards, around driving technology cost reductions and the right kind of technologies, preventing emissions increases, and activating trade, right, trade policies around global industrial or globally traded industrial commodities. So it's exciting. And harmonized standards, I think, will really help us sprint towards that kind of best potential, within less than 20, 25 years.
So thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And thank you for the audience for coming for this event. I'll just be very brief. We have 2 more events coming up today. One at 3:45 on manage expectations for carbon dioxide removals. in which we will be launching our new report on who should use carbon removal. So if carbon removal is something you're interested in, I highly suggest you to come here in roughly 1 hour. And then at 5 p.m. we'll be talking about electricity grids, because yes, we can produce a lot of renewables, some will go into hydrogen, but we also need the grid to deliver those to the consumers. So thank you very much, thank you everybody, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.